Welcome to the Audiobook Lovin Podcast, discussing all things audiobooks with the authors that write the stories and the narrators that perform them. Brought to you by Viviana, Enchantress of Books.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 13 of the Audiobook Lovin Podcast. And today I am chatting with author Landon Beach and author/narrator Scott Brick, who's returning. So, Landon, welcome to the Audiobook Lovin Podcast. And Scott, thrilled to have you back.
Thanks, Viviana. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and real quick, Scott, congrats on the 2 SOVAs nominations that just came out. So congrats on those 2.
Yeah, I actually was just reading, Landon shot me an email. It was nice news to wake up to.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were like, hey, did you know? And because I don't think anything went out timing as far as when that landing page was published and when announcements were sent out. So a lot of them were like, I did, hoo-hoo, all right. Get those graphics ready to post on social media. But exactly. It was fun to see your name on there. Landon, yeah, welcome. Landon, let's start with you and have you tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been writing and how you got started.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Michigan, and I've been writing since as long as I can remember. And I started writing novels about 19 years ago and had some ups and downs. And the publishing world was a lot different back then than it is now. And finally got to a point where I had written a book called The Wreck. And I said, gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do with this thing. And my wife said, you may not know it, but the publishing landscape has completely changed. And either you're going to put this out on Amazon and see how it does, or else I'm going to put it out there behind your back. And I said, all right, we'll give it a shot. And so that was kind of the start of my journey on publishing my work. And then after I had written 3 novels, I approached Scott's wonderful production manager, Gina Smith, and through that contact and having Scott look at The Wreck, we started our partnership. And that's really when it started, would be the end of the summer of 2019.
Wow. Okay. And Scott, as you are a returning guest, tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been narrating, how you got started. Or what's the abbreviation version of that?
I started narrating on June 10th, 1999. Yeah. I know the date for sure because I wrote it down for tax purposes. Mm-hmm. It's just spiraled from there in a wonderful direction. It's funny because I was always reading throughout my life. I mean, that's the reason I got into this industry, because I'm a huge fan of books. As anybody looks behind me can see, I've got a massive library here in my house.
He does.
Suzanne is always saying, really? You need another book?
Yeah, she says that? Wow, okay.
when I would bump into people at my 20-year, I think it was at my 20-year high school reunion, I had just started narrating, and somebody said, "So what are you doing these days?" And I said, "Well," and I wasn't accustomed to using the word narrate yet. I was just saying, "Well, I'm reading books," and they said, "Yeah, I know. I remember you from school, but what are you actually doing for work?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing it professionally. I'm reading them aloud for audiobooks." And every single person said the same thing. Huh, you know what? That fits. So that was I feel every day I had a day job at a bank for 7 years and I dreaded going to work every day.
Oh, yeah.
But I love going to work every day nowadays. So I'm thankful every single day.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think if that conversation, I would have been there. I'm like, wait, you get paid to read books out loud?
Right? I'm like, I get paid to be well read.
I was
Holy
like,
crap.
dang, where was this when I was in high school?
Exactly.
And thinking about career options, doctors, yeah, fine, whatever. But you guys are here because we're talking about this book called Narrator that's by the way, great cover. And for those that are not aware of it, go look at this cover. It's fantastic. I mean, even the details of the soundproofing foam in the background there was like spot on for the title and what the story is about. I was like, yes, they did their job and their research for the book covers. Yay. But it's called Narrator, which is a psychological thriller. Landon, tell us a bit of this, what this book's about without any spoilers, of course, because it's such an interesting and intriguing premise. And we'll get to why more into that later. But tell us about Narrator.
Sure. So I'll try and hook you in here.
Yeah.
So Narrator is about a performing arts prodigy named Sean Frost, who was born and raised in Michigan. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
And went to New York City, attended Juilliard, but then dropped out. But he was incredible in the theatrical arts. And so he became a 2-time Tony Award-winning playwright and actor in his 20s. And he's at the apex of the profession. Everything's going well, and he can't be stopped. But also, he has some flaws that he was not aware of. But due to that lifestyle and the attention that he gets, those flaws start to emerge. And something goes horribly, horribly wrong with this poor guy. And he has to get out of New York City. And so he travels cross country to Carmel by the Sea in California, and he reinvents himself as an audiobook narrator. And he kind of starts at the ground level, but he has a following from his theater days. And then he starts to get really good at it and garners a following, and he's starting to get top tier books. But as he starts to become more and more popular again and really hone his craft, his flaws start to emerge as well, until one day he's maybe kidnapped by 2 obsessed fans that want him to read their book, and it's life or death. And I think I'll stop there, and it takes off from there.
Yeah.
When things go horribly, horribly wrong again.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's just one of my favorite phrases.
Yeah.
I know, I've adopted it. It's like I go to my wife and I say, the girls are arguing in the other room, something's gone horribly, horribly wrong.
And she says, damn that Scott Brick.
Like, well, go fix it. I'm like, okay.
Okay. Yeah. Goodness. That's also like, when you go and talk to Scott about having him narrate it, Scott, did you have a moment of like, well, this sounds a bit familiar? Not the that we know of, not the kidnapping part.
Yeah. It's funny. It was first there was him, asking me questions, about the process. And it was part of the extensive research that he had already done. And so he was just asking me about the industry, how things typically happen. And then he told me that, he had this idea. Well, 6 months later, I get an email saying, oh, by the way, tomorrow you should be getting a package in the mail. It's the hard copy. Boom. Narrator, the hard copy that he asked me to look at to read in advance, an advanced reader copy and ARC. And could I give him some feedback? And I went, holy shit, you actually did it. Okay. Because
way to follow through there, Landon.
Well,
we said before, go ahead, Scott.
Well, it's just it's a thing. It's not unique to writers. I think it's creators in general. People just go, oh, I got this idea to do this, and I want to do this, and I want to do this. And then suddenly I go, holy shit, you actually did it. Wow, that's wonderful. But the funniest part of the whole thing was, as I was reading it, I have it in my living room, and it's sitting on the arm of a love seat that we have out there. And I had a couple of friends come over to watch the Indy 500 with me. So this would have been Labor Day weekend, I guess. And it was a big thing. My father and I used to do it together, and it was the first time watching it without him. So my friends came over, and they were so kind. They were just everybody was like being so nice to me. Like, how you doing? Are you sad? You can be sad. That's okay. And my buddy Josh, at the end of it, when he knew I was doing okay, he goes, hey, can I look at this? And he picks up Narrator. And I said, sure. And so he's looking at it like, throughout the race. And he says, do you mind if I take this with me? And I said, well, I actually, I have to finish going through it to give Landon some feedback. And he goes, okay, sure. He says, I'll read it another time. But he holds it up to me. And as he's handing it back to me, he says, you're going to die like this, right? This is how you're going to die. And I was like, yeah, fuck you. Pardon my French.
No, you're good.
And he says, no, this is a roadmap.
Well, I've had fans that email me while they're reading the book or after. They're like, I've got to take a break. They're like, but and again, this is fiction. This is Sean Frost. And they're like, is Scott okay? And I'm like, I said, Scott's fine, I assure you. And then I put in ellipses.
Yeah, I assure you, I think.
Dun, dun, dun.
Viviana, and I surprised Scott with the project because I wanted to make sure that I was ready before I did it. And it only came because of our friendship and the fact that I was working with an audiobook narrator, which was a business I had absolutely zero clue about. I knew that I enjoyed them and listening, and I knew there was artistic expression in there and a heck of a lot of work that went behind it, but I had no respect for that in terms of researching to know exactly how much it was. But we were on a Zoom call for a pre-recording conference for Huron Breeze, which was a book that Scott was going to record. And our relationship,
which just got the Thriller of the Year, wasn't it? Well,
yes.
Somebody give us the details, and then we'll get back to the story.
Yeah, details.
Yeah, on Beth'sThrillers.com, they have an international competition, and Huron Breeze was just named the Mystery of the Year for 2022. So I was completely shocked to find that out a few days ago. So thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. No, it was fun. We've got the sequel coming up, which is so weird that Scott and I were just talking about our next conference to talk about recording that one and to see where the character's journey goes next. And all of a sudden that gets announced. But anyways, we were doing our conference for Huron Breeze and talking about some decisions and what we could do and just having fun. And then I had 10 questions I wanted to ask him. And I said, Scott, do you mind if I interview you? And he said, sure. What about it? It took him back a little bit because he's like, things are going well about Huron Breeze. What do you want to know now? I said, well, I kind of looked down. I'm like, oh my gosh. And Viviana, my legs are shaking at this point. I'm like, okay, you better do this, you wimp. And I said, Scott, it's an idea about an audiobook narrator that maybe gets kidnapped. And he paused what he was doing. He was looking down his computer and he just like stared at me. And I'm like, oh, shoot. And then he's like, well, sure. And, it was kind of tongue in cheek for the reasons like no one had ever written one about this. And he's done over 1,000 of them. And I said, we're going to break some new ground here. But I finally have my idea after 20 years of searching how to do an entertainment comeback story that would be new and fresh and something that fans hadn't seen before, because disc jockeys, actors, and producers, novelists, you name it, it's all been represented on film. But I didn't think that anyone had ever done one with an audiobook narrator within the framework of a psychological thriller. And so, to make a long story short, I got through 4 questions, and I'm nervous too, because this is Scott's turf. I mean, he's a legend in the industry and he's built up this impressive career. And, who am I here to suggest doing, the first book, so to speak, of an audiobook narrator and a thriller? And all of a sudden it started, the screen started freezing. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And the power cut out.
Oh no.
And I had not given him a chance to explain anything like, hey, I've done 12 to 18 months of research, buddy. I swear to God, I've got your back on this. It just ended before I said that. And I'm sitting in the dark here in my office. And I'm like, what is Scott Brick thinking right now on the other end of this? I'm so nervous. And it came back probably after 30 minutes. And again, he's busy and I'm busy. We've got stuff to do. So there was just a little, a short email in my inbox, like, hey, buddy, sounds good. I'll start recording here on Breeze soon. I'm like, oh, shoot. but then I went off and wrote it. So it was, I don't know, a comedy of errors in some ways of how it ever came to be in the first place. But once we got rolling and we got into the late spring and early summer, I mean, it was a collaboration unlike anything I've ever had. I am so proud and happy of that. Like, if I never do anything else in the creative arts again, that I will hold this experience so dear to my heart with my friend, with what we were able to put out. I'm really just, I don't know. I can't believe it's been 3 months since it came out already.
It's funny because, that's as many times as we've talked about it, that's Landon's takeaway memory of the experience. Mine, other than my friend telling me, yeah, you're going to die this way, is other than that was Landon sent me 2 prospective covers. His cover designer had 2 ideas, and Landon says, I know which one my favorite is, but I don't want to influence your decision. Which one do you prefer? And it's the one that he wound up using. And for those of you who haven't seen it, it's, you got a desktop, you got a microphone, and then you got a carving knife stuck into the desktop, and there's blood everywhere. And when I emailed him, I said, well, I prefer this one. And I just have to laugh because there are so many haters out there. There's so many people on Twitter who just give me no end of shit. And I'm like, this one will make them very happy.
I know. I had J.D. Barker, who is a New York Times bestselling novelist and has become a friend, who gave the book a read, and he gave me a blurb. And I opened up the email and it said, "Finally, a narrator gets what he deserves." I'm like, J.D. But then in a wonderful twist of fate, the next line is, "And Scott Brick is wonderful at this." He goes, "This is misery in stereo." I'm like, oh, JD's got our back. It was crazy.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, it's true because there have been stories about that, the comeback of anything from, CEOs to sports and everything, but no one's really talked about audiobooks. But that's also because audiobooks hasn't, while they have been around for eons, been no books on tape. I still have my Pinocchio Vanio. Yeah.
They've been around for 100 years.
Exactly. But it hasn't really, you guys as the performer and the narrators weren't really ever in the forefront. We didn't know anything about you. We didn't know names. We were like, oh, he kind of sounds familiar. Did I listen to another book that he narrated? But it was never a thing. And then as technology continues to move forward, and we have things like social media and Facebook and Twitter and all this other fun stuff, and now
which can also be some of the cruelest places on earth.
Oh yeah, trust me, I know. But we have now here where the narrators are being more social on social media, and we can they have fandoms and they have official fan groups and they have publicists and things like that, and there's a really huge community of listeners that's how they do their only type of readings. I mean, we always say that there's the eyeball reader, the mix of the two, and the listeners. And the listeners are really, really, fans. And when they love a narrator, they love a narrator. But when they don't like a narrator, they don't like a narrator.
Somebody posted on my Facebook page the other day, they said, I'm halfway through, going to bed with both of you right now.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that? I think I just loved it.
Oh, dude, Scott knows. Yeah,
no, I've had so many instances. It's funny. Suzanne and I had just started dating, and she came to a mystery writers conference with me in Long Beach, maybe 40 miles south of where I live, and there was this elderly woman. She was so kind, and she had just the butteriest Southern accent, and she shakes my hand. She takes it in both of hers. She holds on to my hand, and she says, "I just want you to know, you are the only man other than my husband that I have taken to bed with me for the last 40 years." And I said, I'm just really grateful you said that in front of my girlfriend. I'm like, see, honey, this is, and ordinarily, my self-deprecating humor, it just my kind of need to say something, just to get past furious blush in my face, I typically say, well, when somebody says, I fall asleep listening to you every night, I say, well, I have that effect on women. But they're actually trying to pay me a compliment, so
Yes.
I try to shut off that response and say, well, that's very kind, thank you.
It's like the comment that was left on Facebook, and I've seen those on Scott's social media too. And I definitely think that they're just saying this has been a great experience, and they have their following, and they just like certain narrators are kind of their favorites. That they want to listen to. So it's always neat to hear that.
Yeah, no, it's again a great community. But similar to the premise of your book, sometimes there is that line that gets crossed as far as the fandom goes, and there's a lot more fangirling happening, and there's lines that are crossed constantly. And so when I saw the problem, I'm going, I wonder if, I can totally see a couple of romance narrators having to deal with this. That's for sure.
Totally.
All right. Yeah. And it is one of those things where from a fan perspective, I've always been very much on professional levels and things like that. I mean, I will fangirl in private to you guys if need be, but it's also knowing and respect that you are also a human being.
Yeah. And,
in some cases, they are significant others that you guys have, and so have to be respectful of them. And there's also a way to say it, like, when you said that line, oh my God, right? But without getting into details. But some fans are not like that. They have no limits. They have no boundaries. And I've seen that firsthand, and I'm going, just because you can doesn't mean you should say it.
Yeah.
And I've seen it where narrators have put them politely, professionally back in and stay within the lines, and others that just seem to revel off of it and even egg some of the bad behaviors on. And I'm going, when y'all get kidnapped by that crazy loon,
right.
I don't want to hear it.
Yeah, it's funny because my girlfriend, Suzanne Elise Freeman, she's a narrator as well, and but she also for the romance community works under the name Samantha Cook, and it's funny. Oh, and by the way, we just got engaged.
Yes, congratulations!
Thank you very much. Just want to let the community know. It's funny that we were at an awards ceremony a couple of years ago, and we happened to bump into Lauren Blakely, and she was like, "Oh, it's so nice to run into you both, and you're here together." And we're like, "Well, yeah, we're a couple." And she went, "Oh," and next thing you know, she's writing a project for the two of us.
Yes,
that she cast us in specifically because we're a romance couple. It's so funny. Sometimes the feedback that you get, the responses that you get from listeners, but when those listeners are also authors, even better.
Yeah, there's been many that we know when there's couples and things like that. I remember working on that project with Lauren. I was a production manager, and when I was getting the list of the narrators, I'm going, okay, cool. And then I see your name and I see her name. I'm like, Samantha Cook. Oh, and Scott Brick. Okay, good. Just because Samantha's awesome. I think sometimes the ladies don't get the love and adoration that they need.
They don't get anywhere near enough
that the guys do.
Appreciation.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
And nothing to take away from the male's performances or anything like that. But again, it is a cis female, especially in romance. And so a lot of times the self-insertion happens, and I'm like, it's not real, it's fiction. You sometimes have to remind them and also show them the love to the female narrators. And so I'm always making sure that I do my due diligence and my best to be the example and to rave about the ladies. So literally I did do that. I'm like, Samantha, okay, I'm Scott. Awesome, Scott. Good.
Well, it's true. Is when you break up a romance book into two narrators, his perspective, her perspective, or two hises or two hers, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But in the male female dynamic, the woman who's narrating the book is always doing the heavy lifting. She is always going to be doing so much more of the work, but because women are the primary audience for romance novels, all you got to do is you just have to have a sexy voice, and that's enough. And everybody just, oohs and ahs. And I'm like, look, I'll take it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
But the fact of the matter is, Suzanne did all the heavy lifting on that book.
Yeah. So now you're taking notes, Landon, for the next book that you have to write about, romance narrators.
Well, he's actually working with Suzanne right now.
Oh,
which
see?
is a really wonderful thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the project that we're working on. It's going to be a novella that is the book within a book of the series that Scott and I are working on, of Huron Breeze, Huron Nights, and Huron Sunrise. It's about an author who writes a bunch of thrillers that have been bestsellers. And so I came up with the idea, wouldn't it be neat between the second and third book of the trilogy, where you actually get a novella, which is somewhat of an origin story of this amazing character who is actually in the books within the books. So we're going to give it a shot, but we had a great conference and a talk the other night. And Suzanne, I was just blown away by just her ideas and knowledge of the genre, and helped me out as an author. And it was the first time I ever did a conference with a narrator before writing the book. And again, trying to think a little bit outside of the box. I don't know if it's successful or not, but saying, what if I talked with the narrator beforehand and got some of her ideas? Because this is fun anyways. It's just, this usually doesn't happen in publishing. It's, if anything, it's still about the main story. It's never about a side story. It's a novella within the story universe. And so this is something entirely different. And gosh, I was just blown away by her ideas and instincts as a storyteller that have helped me out as I'm framing the story, still working on my research before I write it, but I'm getting close. And that was neat. I didn't know it, said, let's try it, Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there's a lot of times where when you're reading a book and a story and there's a side character that pops in, and literally it could be that they just pop in for that one scene. And then all of a sudden we all get fixated. We're like, when do they get their book? And we want to know more about them.
Everybody loves them.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. When we were working on Huron Breeze, again, there is a book within the book. The thriller is the main character is a writer, and so there's constant references to her novel. And Landon, God bless him, he put in this Easter egg that, the audiobook narrator of that book within the book is Suzanne Elise Freeman. And I read that and I was like, that's lovely. And I told Suzanne, and she just squealed with delight. She goes, that is so fucking cool. Sorry, French. But then I emailed Landon and I said, she has at least, I don't remember how many lines there were. There were a handful of lines that Suzanne, as herself, as the narrator, I think there was a scene where she's introducing the latest title. There's a press, it's a press conference, and the narrator is there to, reveal the title of the upcoming book. Right. And I said, hey, Landon, you want me to actually have Suzanne do this? Because, she's just right upstairs.
He has a hookup, Landon.
Right, yeah, exactly.
I was like, hell yes, Scott.
Well, it's like one of those people who says, hey, I know a guy. It's like, well, I actually know her. She came down, she did the line. We had her do the intro credits, the outro credits, just so that, her voice wouldn't come as a surprise. But it just kind of took off from there. It's so funny.
And for Huron Nights, we're building on that main character, and Suzanne will be in there as well because she is the narrator of the series. But I just got the cover back today, which is finalized, and on it it'll be the third book, the final book in the trilogy, Huron Sunrise. And it'll say narrated by Scott Brick and Suzanne Elise Freeman, because not to give too many spoilers away here, but I have a couple scenes set where, because no one knows who the author is, it's a pen name, and it's one of the most closely guarded secrets in publishing. But in the third book, Suzanne is going, as the narrator, is going to meet that character. And so there's a scene where she's going to be able to meet this author that she's never met. And then there'll be a part 2, I think, where she's narrating actually some of the final chapter of the last book that writer is writing. And then, Scott will be, doing most of the book, but there'll be a couple things in there where they'll both get a credit on that. So I can't wait for that to happen. It's going to be just a neat arc for a trilogy.
That's fantastic. And again, that's sometimes stuff like that has happened in the romance genre and not so much in the thriller mystery. So to be able to kind of see some of that stuff go into other genres is fantastic, especially when sometimes romance gets such a bad rap of it not being serious writing or anything like that. Yeah, I know, right? Like, fucking
it's ridiculous. It's great writing. It's great writing.
Mm-hmm. And so now, like, oh, look at that. The mystery and the thriller, they're taking a little hint from us. Okay.
Yeah, they're catching up to you.
Yeah, right? Like, we've been doing this for years.
And a lot of our collaborations, specifically for Narrator, but also for these other books, have been just Scott and I saying, why not? Why not? Let's do this. Why the heck not?
It's good to be thinking outside the box. Now, the one thing when I was listening to Narrator that I was like, oh yeah, because I have been behind the scenes, so I know a lot of the stuff that happens in creating an audiobook. Still, sometimes I'm learning some of the terminology and things like that. And so, Landon, I know you were mentioning that you were doing a bunch of research and you did also talk to Scott. Did you also talk to other narrators, or was Scott your primary go-to researcher for your answers? And how was that to do all that research?
So I'll back up real quick and just give you how I got the idea, and that led me into the research. But I had been thinking for 20 years that I wanted to write a book like this. But as I said earlier in the interview, I could never figure out a way to make it work and how to have something fresh and new and exciting that the audience hadn't seen, or in this case, read or listened to before. But I've studied film all of my life as well. I studied it in college, and my degree is in screenwriting. And so I live and breathe, that area. It's one of the reasons we get up in the morning, is just to watch film and read and talk to other artists. I mean, it's so lonely in this room by yourself. And so I had 4 films that just would not, leave my mind over the years. And Vertigo, Play Misty for Me, Misery, and A Beautiful Mind. And then when I was an educator, there was a short story that I taught called The Continuity of Parks by Julio Cortázar. And those 5 seminal works kept speaking to me over and over. They kept whispering to me over and over, but I would whisper back, I don't have a way to fit you in. And then when I worked with Scott, I said, this is it. In an audiobook narrator, but I was really protective of the idea. I didn't say anything to anyone, including poor Scott, until
surprise,
sidelined him about 18 months afterwards. But to answer your primary question about did I talk to other narrators, in a way, yes. And that would be, there are so many, like you said, the rise of social media and interviews. I watched hours and hours and hours of YouTube footage where narrators would be interviewed and they'd talk about their process and, the highs and lows, the challenges of the industry, what they loved about it. And I got very much a sense of what you said, that it is this wonderful community, so supportive, and something that not a lot of people know about. And it's something that they take for granted. And so there were other things that, I would read too, articles online. And so that was my primary research through many, sleepless nights and, weeks and days and months, probably between 12 and 18 months, give or take, based on the fact that I was still working full time and have, a wife and 2 young children. And so and a golden retriever that I love that makes it into the book in a certain kind of way with a different name. But and then with Scott, it was those questions that I asked. And then when he was gracious enough to take a look at the manuscript and see the research that I had done, it was neat just for tweaking. And he would say, try this. This doesn't actually work this way, but there might be a way around it. And we would exchange ideas on that front. And he would help me out too. He'd say, you're not really that far away from the microphone when you're, whispering or you want to lower your voice. You're this far away, which I had no idea. And even points where I thought, gosh, Scott's going to pat me on the back here with this research about the coaches and, the directors. And he looked at the list and he's like, brother, I appreciate your work, but they really don't have those jobs. You have some that need to be as coaches, and here are a few Grammy Award winners in directors that I've worked with, but that gave the book authenticity. And so, of course, I welcomed those 100%. And, Viviana, we've said, had this been book one, it just wouldn't have happened. When you have you just don't have that trust yet, and you're still working out the kinks of your working relationship. And to be quite honest, for most narrators and authors, they never see each other or talk to each other.
Yeah.
In fact, in some places it's frowned upon. They're like, we don't want you talking to the author. We want you to do this. But when we got past book 3 and we discovered that we had a lot in common, and that, that we inspired each other with talking creatively about ideas, then it turned into something completely different. And so it opened it up for this kind of the best idea wins mentality for the 6th. And never once when we made suggestions, it was unbelievable. I kept pinching myself. I'm like, this can't be true. You hear all these horror stories. And believe me, in those 12 to 18 months, I had read about them. Like, authors that I might know who, when the audiobook comes out, just trashing their narrator. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And so, but we just would be like, yes, that's totally the way to go. And Scott saved me on some things that would have been, it wouldn't have taken probably your average reader out. But that 1% that I was dead set to catch, I wanted, anyone in the audiobook industry, just to know that this was kind of my love letter to them, that I appreciate and value what they do. I didn't want anything to take them out of the experience. And that's where, I called in the big guns. he's like, this is what you need to do, buddy.
Listen, I remember there was a time, Viviana, right before the book came out. I had finished my narration almost a month before, and it was in post. We're just waiting on the final files. It's about maybe a week before it debuted.
Right.
And yeah, exactly. And Landon emails me and says, "There's something that's kind of nagging at me." In the book, I use the phrase, in Sean's voice. He says, "I hit the record button." And he said, and I didn't catch it at the time, but Landon looks at it and he goes, "Is that a thing? Is that part of the nomenclature, right? Is that part of just the vocabulary of voiceover people?" And so I sat and I sat with it, and I thought, well, this is software. It's not hardware. There is no actual button that says record. Like on Staples, there's the OK button, whatever.
That's what I woke up in the middle of the night one night, about a week before, and I saw the red Staples button on my wall. And I'm like, do they hit a button like that to start recording? And I'm like, I've gotten it all wrong.
That. I never knew that. I never knew that was the inspiration.
A bunch of years ago.
So then I'm emailing. I'm like, Scott, do you hit a button? Is there a magic button? He's like, no.
And I said, well, I hit a button. It's the number 3 on the keypad on the keyboard. And I said, but that's a macro. That's a software thing. It's a shortcut.
Right.
And I said, so technically, no, there is no record button. And he said, do you say I hit record? Is that something that comes up in conversation among voiceover people? And I said, oh, hell yeah.
Yeah.
We talk about that all the time. And he goes, okay, great. He goes out and he fixes it.
Yeah.
And we did it as a pickup. And for the 0.1% of the listening audience that's going to matter to, he had their back.
Yeah. And thank you for that, because there's times when we're reading and listening to a book and there's a specific thing, whether it's a military term because it's, romantic suspense or a thriller and things, and then they're using something, you're going, no, that's not what we say. Or in my case, culinary, and like, no, that's not the right dice for that dish. And there's the little thing, like, it's just a little more research, dude. Just a little more research, dude.
We were on another podcast, and it was someone, of course, who was in the industry. And he said, I kept waiting for there to be a mistake so I could go, and he says, and it never came. And so that meant a lot to get that feedback. But you're right. A couple of my novels are sea adventures. and we always say as Seed Venture authors, there's there's a lot of interesting emails and posts go back, but we've kind of labeled them the boat and gun people. But there are the boat and gun people.
Oh yeah,
read those books.
Oh God,
and
yeah.
If you have anything wrong, I mean, we're talking your life's work here for a 300-page book. You have one thing wrong, it's a 1 out of 5, and they say this one thing, and then some of them are, I mean, they're even unfair. My first book, The Wreck, I've got some underwater action and some scuba diving scenes. And I had 2 Hall of Fame scuba divers read the manuscript and write a beautiful blurb. And for me, that was enough. I'm like, okay, I've passed that threshold. And even then, you get some amateur diver who goes on, one of the review sites and gives you a 1 out of 5 and, marks something about the scuba diving, which they're actually wrong. And I'm like, I'm the Hall of Fame scuba divers here. And then you look underneath, and that's why it's not healthy to do this, by the way, and there's like 18 people found this healthy. I'm like, damn it.
Yeah.
Listen, I remember one time I had a reviewer. His name was Yuri Rozovsky, and he was a lovely man. I think our only time we ever had an issue was about this one book that he was reviewing, because he was not only a producer of audiobooks, he would adapt classics into a multi-voice format, and the first Grammy nomination was through him. He did the Mark of Zorro, and I got to play the bad guy opposite Val Kilmer, of all people, which was absolutely marvelous. But Yuri, when he put on his reviewer's hat, he came to a book I did, a nonfiction title that took place around the turn of the last century. And there's a term for a car in the same way, you would call it, well, is it a coupe? Is it a wagon? What is it? And it's spelled Phaeton. And he says, you mispronounced phaeton. I'm like, no, I didn't. He said, it's phaeton. And I said, you're talking about the Greek god Phaeton. And he says, yeah. And I said, I was talking about a type of automobile where they took the name Phaeton and they made it their own, and they called it a Phaeton. He goes, but that's wrong. And I'm like, not in the world of cars, it isn't. I went to the Peterson Automotive Museum in First of all, I went to my dad, who was the ultimate, car geek.
Right.
And I said, it's Phaeton, isn't it? It's not pronounced the way that the Greek god is. And he goes, oh no, it's Phaeton. And I called the Peterson Automotive Museum, and they said, it is absolutely a Phaeton. And I told that, he puts it in print. Oh. It's like, Scott Brick doesn't do his research. And I saw him at a party, and I said, Yuri, I love you, but fuck you. Yeah. and it was the only time, and sadly he's gone now, but it was the only time I think I ever won an argument when he finally went, oh, right.
Yeah. It happens a lot. And part of that too is, as you were saying before, once the narrator gets the script, there is no communication with the author and the narrator. If the narrator and author are both lucky, they are told to submit pronunciation sheets and anything to do with accents and things like that. Otherwise, there's the prep work that the narrator has to do, and hopefully they do their due diligence in doing that research. Some do, some cold read, some don't. So they leave it there. And and it is one of those where times have changed, and I think indie authors have a really good benefit in being able to connect with the narrator and say, hey, this is how we pronounce it, especially when it comes down to sci-fi and fantasy, where words are made up, and with specific dialogue too, and dialect. So it's like made up, but still real, and having the narrator to have that connection. So I think that's where I was impressed as I was listening. Them going, because I was also kind of waiting for that mistake. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm sorry. But I was so happy.
It's your area of expertise. It's your area of expertise.
And I know people, so I could have checked.
Exactly.
Well, I'll tell you what. Part of the research too was actually going through the process with Scott. And Scott, tell me if I'm right here, but the researcher that you have used his name is Reggie, right?
Reggie was he was my engineer.
George was
And
the
sadly,
researcher, right?
sadly, Reggie passed away. George Weisberg is my researcher. Yes.
Yeah, and so it was neat to have, to see notes that George had given Scott. And so that's when I'm like, oh, there's a whole other level here that I'm not getting that goes on. And in the cabin, I know firsthand Scott does his research and is professional, because I had a Russian character that I was going to go with a lot of what Americans say,
Right.
Vladimir. And
Right.
I said, I think so. And then I had no idea. And he said, well, actually, Landon, it's Vladimir. And I looked at his he was really nice and wrote me a paragraph about why that was, the way it should be. And then I said, I was like, I've got some things to learn here. I'm getting schooled in real time. But it was, but even that, though, that made me think about when I wrote Narrator, that actually goes on. And so we wanted to make that authentic.
Yeah.
It's funny I mentioned that because having done a number of thrillers over the years, there's also the name Ivan, which Americans say Ivan. And yet anybody from that part of the world says Ivan. And yet it's become a thing where especially people in the in the services, CIA, FBI, whatever, the clandestine services, whenever they talk about Russians, they talk about Big Ivan or just Ivan. And yes, it is Americanized, but they're doing it to talk about this culture. Well, that's fine for Ivan, but we're going to do different things over here. So in a book, you're going to have a character. If you have a character in the book actually named Ivan, from his perspective, it will always be Ivan. And yet from the American's perspective, it always has to be Ivan, just to sound right.
Yeah. Yeah, and being able to have that information, and even when it's dual narrated, because that's happened too sometimes where, and Scott, right. I'm sure it's one of those, you would say Ivan and you don't say Ivan, or the other way around. It's the same thing with the pronunciations of cities and streets. Those that are different from the locals versus where outsiders would say. But when there's two narrators, the importance of the two of them getting together and say, how are we going to say this? It's so important. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Because either production companies or publisher houses don't connect them either. So it's not just you guys as authors. Sometimes it happens with the narrator, so you're not alone.
Well, one of my favorite stories of us going through this together and recording was Scott said that he would leave the booth for the day and head upstairs, and Suzanne would say, so what happened to you today, Sean?
Oh yes.
And then Scott would name that particular part of the book of what horrible thing had happened.
Yeah.
Oh,
I would say, well, I got the shit kicked out of me by my jailer.
They wanted me to record in a room with no soundproof. I mean, how dare they?
It's really funny.
Amateur hour.
It's funny because she actually listens to audiobooks that I do. And I've listened to her as well. But she listens a lot more. She, in her spare time, is doing craft projects. And so, as she's sewing something or printing something or, whatever, she makes these handmade cards. And, she can have her earbuds in and be listening to maximize her time. And it's so funny because, half the time she's saying, will you shut the hell up so I can be surprised when I'm listening to it? Can you maybe tell me how your day went without ruining all the surprises? And the other half of the time, I'll walk into the room, and she'll always do that telltale tap against her ear, putting it on pause, and I'll be like, what are you listening to? And she goes, I'm listening to you. Would you go away so I can hear you? It's hysterical.
It's too cute. I love it, though.
Well, and for people, in the community, it just happened to be that a voiceover conference in Texas was taking place the week that we launched. And so I registered and I sent some material over there. And of course, again, as an independent, on a budget, there's not a way to kind of let, hey, everybody in the world know this book's coming out. So, it was just a really, kind of conservative and calculated launch in the places that we could when it came out. But that was one of the places to start to get the word out, that there was a book about the industry that we hope that industry professionals would enjoy. And Scott sends me from the conference. He's like, I have people coming up that are looking at this poster going, what is this?
Yeah. People were like, there's this thing called Narrator. What is this? And why is it violent?
Yes.
Of course, there's the image of the cover art of the knife with blood on it.
Like, what do you do?
But dozens of people asked me about it during this voiceover conference. That's what I really appreciate about Landon, among other things, is that it's become a cliche to say he thinks outside the box. But he really does in ordinary circumstances, and I know this because just like I work for authors who are working in a similar genre to Clive Cussler. So they would reach out to Clive while he was still here. They would reach out to him for a cover quote, right? For a blurb. This guy is the best thing since sliced bread, whatever. And then the same in the thrillers, they reach out to Lee Child, the creator of Jack Reacher, and they would say, Lee would give them a blurb. And quite often people would hire me because, hey, I'm working on an aquatic thriller and you do Clive Cussler's work. So, that might be, a good marriage. In Landon's case, rather than reaching out, he did reach out to his fellow authors, thriller authors for Narrator, but he made it his mission, his focus was to get voiceover people to give blurbs. And he sent me a list of just how many people he reached out to. Was it Joe Cipriano and Dave Fennoy and and so many colleagues, Ray Porter, the audiobook narrator. He gave.
Oh, we know who Ray is.
He gave this wonderful blurb that said, it's innovative, it's a surprise every second kind of thriller, and I'm going to go put a lock on my studio door. But again, it was like, well, for this audience, it seems like these blurbs would mean more than a Lee Child or whomever.
Ray ended up doing our intro and outro for us, and Scott had talked to him about it.
Yeah, because Landon was kind enough to dedicate the book to me, said lovely things about me. And then again, at the end of the book, in the author's notes, he talked about the research process and to the extent that it was collaborative. He said wonderful things about me, and I'm like, I don't need any help to sound self-centered. I really don't want to read these aloud myself. So I hired Ray to do it, and as I love to say, I have now officially paid someone to say nice things about me. But he recorded an alternate version that was so filthy. It was so rude. He was like, what? It was 90 seconds, and it was just filled with filth and literary references. And he said, what can I say about Scott Brick other than he is a complete and utter tool? But he didn't use the word tool. He used a word that begins with a C that is not polite. And it just went on from there. And I said, I'm sorry, man. He emails me this audio file, and I forwarded it to Landon. I said,
I had tears in my eyes because it was literary and foul at the same time. I'm like, my gosh. Well, and someone who listened to it, contacted me, and they were a bit thrown off. Kind of, they're like, "Wait a minute, this isn't Scott, starting this off." And they said, "Is that Ray Porter?" And all I could write back was, "Dark side is everywhere."
Exactly, dark side. You
Yeah.
cannot escape Dark Side.
No, he's everywhere, man.
Yeah,
Man,
he
if
is
you have
omnipresent.
that file, I may ask later on, like, hey, hook a girl up. I would love to
I'll
hear
totally
that.
forward
Yeah.
it to you. I'll totally forward it to you, but it is not safe for work.
No, just trust me. Nearby.
Please keep it between us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I am a Volt. You guys do know that. The other thing too, I will say, I was actually playing a game while listening to the book because of those references of, the audio from the industry part of it. But I'm also wondering, like, okay, who do I know that sounds like this as far as caricature goes? So I was wondering if anybody's gonna pop up that I'm going, I think I know who they're talking about, even though they're using another name. And at the same time, there is a scene. So I'm gonna start with Michael Honey. Was he tell us who Michael Honey is for those that have not read the book yet or listened to it. And then was he inspired by anybody that we may know? No names needed, but maybe yes or no.
So one is Michael Honey is this mythical audiobook narrator who is at the top of the profession. He is who Sean Frost is, trying to unseat or at least equal. He wants to get on his level. And so I came up with a ridiculous amount of Audies that he had won, over the years. In terms of being inspired, no one person in all of my research. But what I did was I tried to take for the characters that are in there, a conglomeration of different narrators that I had studied. The most common question that I get asked in fans' email, they're like, is Scott Brick Sean Frost? Is that him? And I'm like, no. But I said, I thought he was perfect to play that part. And there are a few things that Sean does in his routine, because I thought the audience, it would be neat to know. And again, you've got to dramatize it, because if you're not, it's going to be so boring that, you shut it off. Just like if I was writing about my writing day, someone would stop after about 5 seconds, but you got to dramatize it. And I thought, what if they, might a little sneak peek into booth rituals about, dabbing your lips with lip balm, throat coat tea and whatnot. And so there are a few that Scott uses, and there are a few that he does not use that other narrators use. So I use that to kind of build those different characters. But I think, the concept, if you will, of an archetype of someone who's at the head of the industry and an up-and-comer who's trying to rival them and compete, I think that you could probably, in any industry, if you go acting or sports, we could all name who they probably are. But no, there was no one in particular where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna hide this person. Like Michael Crichton used to say, someone asked him, they said, do you ever write about real people? And he said, and he paused and he said, well, says there's always been a few people that I'd like to get back at, but I hide them in the book. And like there's one guy who gets like sliced up and eaten, and I was like, in one of his books, I'm like, God, I wonder who that was.
Well, they do say don't piss off an author; they'll kill you off in the story.
Totally.
I've had a few thoughts behind the keyboard before.
Years ago, when Mel Gibson was playing Hamlet on film, he was working with Helena Bonham Carter, and they were being interviewed, I seem to recall, by Diane Sawyer. And she said, so the question everybody wants to know, Hamlet and Ophelia, did they or didn't they? Did they ever sleep together? And they asked Helena Bonham Carter, and God bless her, she was like, yes. And here's why. And she goes into this lengthy, explanation. There's this in the text. There's this that's referenced. This I interpreted. Yada yada yada. And they actually they lowered her volume to the point where she was muted. And then they show on a split screen Mel Gibson being asked the question, and he said, "Well, I will quote Lord Olivier, who was asked this question years ago. Did Hamlet and Ophelia have sex? Yes. Once. On tour." But also, I have actually, a number of colleagues have listened to Narrator, and they have come to me and they have asked me, "Am I Michael Honey?"
You see?
and there's this one guy who's so funny. He's a dear friend, and yet he asks me all the time, and he's totally serious. He's not saying this as a joke. He goes, "I'm so much better than you are. Why do I make so much less money than you do?" That's just who he is. So,
at least you know where you stand with him, right? At least,
totally,
So,
and I'm like, I don't care, whatever. But yeah, no, there is no Michael Honey.
Okay. I was just wondering, because as I was sitting and going, I think I know someone like that that's in the industry. But again, as most books say at the very beginning, everything's a work of fiction. There's similarities that, blah, blah, blah. But I still was going, okay. And then I get to that scene in the Audis. So, Landon, authors have admitted to doing this to Scots, but they have admitted to doing it in general, is the adding specific creative words and or accents to see if they could do it. Like, that's their challenge and things like that. But you, being obviously in this world too, I think I was wondering if you purposely put the, Tom Hanks in there as that equivalent, like having him do a Tom Hanks and then add the impression of Woody in there during the delivery of the speech for the Audis. Was that one of those?
That was tough. That was tough.
So I have put things in books not only because of my love of them, but there has been some, selfish reasons in my previous works where Scott and I have a love of Shakespeare. And there's a part that totally fits within the flow of the book and is meaningful. But I do get excited as I'm typing it up, thinking, I do want to hear Scott say those words that Shakespeare wrote 400 years ago. And it's not out of, I wonder if I can trip him up or something like that. I know he has some authors that he's very good friends with that do that. It's really, kind of charming to go back and forth and hear that as they're putting together a book. And I think that only comes, out of deep friendship and respect between author and narrator. So yes, there are selfish reasons sometimes when I put in some Shakespeare that I was going to put in anyways, but there's an extra energy to it because I know I get to hear Scott read Shakespeare and it's just so wonderful. I listen to those parts just because I took my oldest daughter to see the 5 actors from the London stage this past weekend put on Macbeth, and I was just completely blown away by what they were able to do. I absolutely love live theater, and I think my enthusiasm comes through in this book for that because I love it so much. But in terms of the Tom Hanks and later Oprah and Billy D. Williams and whatnot, those are all things that just performers and hosts like Oprah that I just have so much respect for and have followed for years that were appropriate for that scene. But again, it's trying to give the audience something new. To my knowledge, I know Stephen King won, I think, a Lifetime Achievement Award at a previous Audis that was there. But no one
days before the world shut down.
Yeah, no one from other circles. And I said, very much in the performing arts and voiceover world, I said, well, why not have Tom Hanks be a performer? I'm Hollywooding it up somewhat, and maybe that's selfish too, because I do want to see this get made into a movie. I think it would be perfect. I think it would be amazing to go see this and have more people exposed to just audiobook narration and what goes into it and the love and respect that I've grown. It would be neat to see it get that kind of platform. And then of course, Steven Spielberg at the end, just a director who's meant a lot to me throughout my life in his works, especially just because with Scott and I, we were right at the perfect age when all those movies with Lucas and Spielberg and Coppola came out that just they don't quite leave you. I mean, we're coming up on Christmas and there's that wonderful song Toyland, and once you cross that border, you can never go back. And I tear up at that song every year because you want to hang on to those childhood memories when everything was just so new. And, my youngest daughter, still believes in Santa right now. My oldest has been in on the gig for a long time, helping us wrap presents. But to see her in that wonderment and you remember it, you just don't want to let it go. It's magic. So yeah, it was deliberate to bring in those different aspects And it was just a bonus to hear Scott perform them, which he nailed.
He did. When you were prepping the book and then having to narrate, Scott, were you a little concerned about because it's different to voice a character because they're not real, versus an impression of them because we know how they sound.
Yeah, exactly. But look, I've narrated book versions of classic films. 40 years after it got made, I was asked to narrate The Graduate. And when you get to that scene at the end, when he's banging on the glass and disturbing the wedding that's going on, and he's screaming, Elaine, Elaine, how can you not do it that way? There's just, I'm sorry, so many actors are like, well, I want to make this my own. Oh, screw that. You know what? Give the people what they want. If the line existed in the book Frankenstein, it doesn't. But if Victor Frankenstein were to scream the words, "It's alive! It's alive!" How could you not do it like the actor did in the 1930 film? It was the same thing every time that there's a reference to, if it's Tom Hanks playing Woody, or there was to be honest, I don't remember whether it was this book or Huron Nights, but there was a reference to somebody would say it was a line from the Towering Inferno. Landon,
yeah, it was this one. It was when Sean was getting pumped up to do something and he needed courage, he'd say the Robert Wagner lines about, I used to run the 110 flat, I'll be back with the whole fire department.
Yeah, and I had to go find that. I watched the Towering Inferno when I was a kid 7-8 times in the theater. It was playing at a movie theater just down the street, and I went there every Saturday. And yet, you got to watch those references to make sure that you're being, authentic. I think there's a difference between accuracy and authenticity. Yes. I'll never sound like Robert Wagner. I'll never, I'm not an impressionist, and yet. I can at least try to be authentic to the way that he said it. So yeah, it's a challenge, but a fun one.
Yeah.
And that's, Viviana, that I would say that what we did in those aspects, because as you know from the book, there are a ton of pop cultural references, which I think are very appropriate for a book like this in the entertainment industry. And someone like Sean Frost, who is immersed in it, I mean, that's what performers do. They remember lines, they act out scenes. I mean, all of us that are creatives, we sometimes we'll be by ourselves. We act out the scene when no one's looking, and then we go back to our lives. It's just fun. It's something that you do. And so what I did in this case, and again, this grew out of the trust that Scott and I have in our previous collaborations, was I sent him, it was either one or two, I can't remember, brother, maybe you do, 1 or 2 emails that were just massive that had every single pop cultural reference in Narrator and the wonders of the internet, with either it was a part, like the actual short story, which is only 2 paragraphs of the continuity of parks. I sent him that, but most of them were YouTube clips from the specific pop cultural reference. And it was always in the spirit of, if this can help you work into the scene, Scott, and use that to your advantage, go ahead. Because he doesn't need me, and he didn't need any of those, frankly, to do a wonderful job. But it was something that, knowing him as a performer, like he said, not an impersonation as an impressionist, but when Sean Frost shouts a line from The Game with Michael Douglas and Sean Penn, I thought what would be neat is to give Scott that clip so he could watch it, see, the tempo of it and how those lines are delivered, and then work into the scene and make it his own that way. So that was something I thought that was really neat about this project, that, we really hadn't gone to those lengths before together.
Well, and what's really cool is that Landon never knew. I've since told him, but knowing where those references came from, being able to, again, it's like, I'm not going to do an impression. I'm just, but it is nevertheless, it's going to give me the opportunity to maybe have a more nuanced performance. Okay, great. But he in the book, Sean narrates a series about a lead character, Nehemiah Stone, And it is a character not unlike Jack Reacher.
Right.
And I work on the Reacher series. I got all the books right up here behind me, but he said that Sean liked to listen to the theme from the 1970s TV version of The Incredible Hulk, because it had that marvelous, heartbreaking piano music at the end. Dun,
So
dun,
good.
dun, 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 dun. It's just gorgeous. That used to be my ringtone, but it was so soft that I couldn't hear my phone ring, so I had to change it to something else. But I've loved that music for years. And when Landon talked about Sean had this ritual where he would listen to the song, which is called The Lonely Man. And he would listen to it every time he went into the booth before recording a Nehemiah Stone novel. Well, I'll tell you what, man, a month and a half, 6 weeks later at most, I'm recording the latest Jack Reacher novel. And the first thing I did is I turned on The Walking Man. The Lonely Man. I turned on the Lonely Man because it really works for Reacher as well.
Yeah.
He is self-sufficient, and yet he misses people, because every now and again he'll tell a woman that he's gotten involved with during the book, and she'll say, hey, you're leaving, aren't you? And he goes, yeah, but you could come with me. And they don't. But there is that aspect to the character as well. And that's what I love about this, is that, something I got from Landon is helping me on another series, It's marvelous.
Yeah, it's all these little different references. And we've seen it now, even TikTok, where sometimes they'll associate a song or this and it comes out in a reaction, or sometimes these Gen Zers are like, oh, it's a new song. I'm like, no, that's not new, honey. That's when I was a teenager in 1990. But I totally get that cultural reference, because I tend to say I'm your Huckleberry. So anytime that anybody needs anything or they want something, or they're like, I'm like, I'm your girl. I'm like, I'm your Huckleberry, and things like that. So, and my kid, who is 20, will bust out with movie quotes from The Breakfast Club. So I totally get those references. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Everything old becomes new again.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
it's real
fun. Where I was, trying to blend in some of the real life, you're asking about Michael Honey and who is that in real life? But I thought
you'll tell me later.
Yeah, offline. It's in Ray Porter's clip. No, I wanted some nods and winks and some Easter eggs, and
oh god,
this would be fun. I thought, well, at the audios, of course, Scott is going to be there and friends of his too, and so. Here is, Sean Frost. And I do remember the day that I was sitting there and I'm coming up to that scene, and it's really early in the book and I've got a lot of energy. Yeah. It's like, suddenly the book is in my mind and I can't type fast enough to get it out there. And as an author, when you sit there and you envision the scene, you imagine that you're there in this ballroom and there's the ceremony that, are kind of the audiobook version of the Oscars. And literally, as an author, at least that I do, I ask myself questions when I write. I go, well, what do I see over here? Who's over at this table? And so being Sean, I'm walking by a table and I said, of course, here's Scott and his friends are sitting at this table on his way, around the room. And so it was fun to hear Scott reference himself.
I know. I was like, oh.
But it was part of the book too, that everybody would kind of get the thing that, yeah, this is a book for us too.
It was so weird for me because I don't think I read through the advanced copy, but he made some changes, and maybe I just wasn't paying attention. Maybe I wasn't self-centered enough. But suddenly in the booth, I look at this section and it says, Sean Frost says, I pass a table with, and he only used last names, but I'll use the full names. He says, I passed a table with Scott Brick, Susanna Elise Freeman, my fiance, Pat Fraley, who's one of the closest friends, dearest friends I've ever had, Ray Porter, who did some of the audio on the book, and Simon Vance. And I'm like, this is my social life.
Yeah.
This is my life. It's so crazy that it's actually in print now.
Yeah. But that I think makes it very authentic and real. Like, oh, okay, this could possibly happen to a narrator and get kidnapped. Okay, so, but I mean,
look, there was also a line that was actually something I said to Landon during that ill-fated Zoom call where he only got 4 questions up before the power went out. He said, what's it like being a famous audiobook narrator?
mm-hmm.
And I told him what I typically say. It's a quip. It's something that I don't mean to be dismissive, but I'm just like, well, a famous audiobook narrator doesn't make me famous,
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, we get to the book. I get to the book, and Sean Frost says, so people always ask me what it's like being, a world-renowned audiobook narrator. And I'm reminded that a colleague of mine once said, it's like being the tallest midget in the room. And I suddenly went, oh, damn, that's right. I did say that to him. And I'm like,
and you're the colleague.
Yeah. I am the colleague. I'm talking about myself. I'm like, if Sean Frost is a narrator, so am I. Therefore, he is my colleague and I am his. That is me. And then of course, I thought, it sounds so dismissive. And I didn't know I was going to be quoted. And I thought, if nothing else, I really should have said little person, but it's authentic. So,
Yep.
But that was a moment of I had to stop and laugh for the longest time in the booth. I'm like, I'm quoting myself.
Well, and the other part too was when we talk about what's the worst thing that could ever happen to an audiobook narrator. Again, I don't want to ruin any of the plot because it may or may not have happened, the kidnapping, and that's left to the reader in Sean's mind as we go through the book. But really, the elephant in the room, of course, is it's a narrator's voice. That is the worst thing that could absolutely happen to a narrator. And I learned more about water than I ever cared to know researching for this book. But it is true what it takes. So there's also that level too. It's acknowledging that I'm going to portray this dramatically, that this is the worst thing that could happen. But in reality, it isn't. But I couldn't write a book about someone who doesn't have enough water. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's that horror story within the horror story of sorts. And for those that are in the industry that are part of it, those little things always makes us go, oh yeah, I know about that. That's true. But the throat coat, the teas and the lip balms, and it was Sebastian York that taught me about the apples and
Sure.
And things like that. When that happens, it's one of those little things like you're in the know and you're like, yay. It's and same thing with you, Scott, when you were saying about like you were the coworker, the one being quoted. When listeners know that an author used their name for a character, you're like, that's me. It's the little things, but it can mean so much to people. And so I'm sure that for Scott and others that are in the industry, to say like, thanks for taking us serious and doing the research and making it legit. Versus, I've been told I have a hot voice and I can be an audiobook narrator, and I've never been published, but I want to start a production company. And there's a story behind that. I'll tell you offline. Because it really happens.
And the Audie scene too was Ray Porter and Andy Weir. They won Audiobook of the Year last year. And Andy's just a fantastic writer. And Ray too. I mean, just amazing narrator. But I love Andy's work, and so I figured, how could I bring that into this audio ceremony? And so I completely made up a science fiction book, that he wrote called Beyond Rigel. But in a way, I was like, maybe he will write it one day.
Yeah. I mean, inspiration comes out of anywhere, right?
Totally.
It totally happens. The other thing too, that because we live in a world where we're getting more connected with everybody, the narrators, have shared significant things that happen in the booth. And I do love and adore that you busted out with booth afflictions.
Oh God.
When that scene first got there, I'm going, where is this going?
I have gotten more questions, more feedback from people about that section of the book than any other.
Well, you guys share about all this stuff that happens in the booth, and I mean,
like I'm sitting there and I'm writing again, and again, you're trying to, bring in some comedy because there's so many things like where people are like, I have to push pause on this. This is so horrible for this poor, Sean Frost. And I'm like, so let's, liven it up with some comedy. And I thought, because authors have this too. We have these inside jokes that go back and forth and just pitter patter to stave off boredom or to keep going. Call it what you want. And I said, narrators probably do too. And so if you're in your booth for so many hours a day, like I'm in this chair in this room for so many hours, I said, I'm sure there's some things that they go back and like, yeah, I've got booth this and booth that today. And I just started putting stuff in there. And now we've been actually officially asked on podcasts. I'm like, all I can say for some of those, I'm like, oh, it's just the worst. You just don't ever want to have it.
But the thing is people are assuming that came from me. When they hear that I gave feedback, they're like, okay, so booth dick.
I was since really, you brought it up.
Right, yeah, no. So many people brought it up, and they're like, so is this a thing? And really what they're asking is, are you Sean Frost? And I'm like, no, I never mentioned booth dick. The only time those words ever came out of my mouth, the first time ever, was in the studio recording this book.
But it was so funny because again, you guys share stuff with us as listeners, either on other interviews or when you're in the booth. And I mean, I had a narrator friend that we were talking on Facebook, and he's like, "Give me a minute, I need to grab my pads." And I'm going, "You're gonna get your what?" and it was the ice packs because it was so hot that I'm like, "Are you wearing like a vest and stuff like that?" He was switching it out, and I'm going, "You're kidding me, right?" And he's like, "No, it's really that hot in here, and I need to have." So they had like ice packs on themselves, and I'm like, "Wow, okay."
Landon, it's a thing. Narrators do. It's almost like a fishing vest. You've got a lot of pockets everywhere, and you just get these those little blue ice packs that you can refreeze. And you get like 12 of them, and you take 6 of them at a time. You put them on, you put them in the vest. Then when they warm up, you have to go put them back into the freezer and get the next 6, just so you can keep cool in the booth.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you where those afflictions, if you want to know, and I've never shared this on any of them.
Yeah, I do want to know.
With Scott, where the inspiration came was years ago. I was listening to a screenwriting podcast, and I believe it was a screenwriter who I really like, John August, and he started talking about when he was writing. He mentioned in the podcast that sometimes he will do method writing, where if it's a really sad scene or an emotional scene, he will work himself up to the point where he's crying and bawling and then write the scene. And I had never heard anything like that before. I'll be the first to raise my hand and say that when one of my beloved characters has met an unhappy end, I have cried many tears in this room because you get so attached to them. And say what you want about it. That's just me. I'm an emotional guy. I care about this stuff. And so when I was coming up with this, and I hadn't even thought about that for years, but it's one of those things where the more that you read, the more that you listen to, the more that you watch, you don't know where you're going to use that. And that came from years ago. And all of a sudden I said, oh yeah, John August, method writing. And then it went into some of the things I it's embarrassing because it's been a while and I'm in the deep edit for this next book right now. So that's what's on my mind. But I want to say in Narrator, I had, some method narrating for what some of the narrators did. But that's where that came from, is a podcast about 8 years ago that I listened to.
They were creative. Toe affliction, booth affliction, both booth toe. And then that last one, and you busted out with, I literally busted out laughing. I'm like, booth dick. Okay. So, me being me, in romance, the thing is, Landon, if you don't know, in these romance books, they, when it comes down to the narration, there's the steamy scenes, and I'm talking about like sex. And sometimes, listeners will ask the narrator, so any reaction after that scene? You will not just ask them that, dude.
Listen, I'll tell you,
crossing the line.
I was in Midland, Texas, doing one of my very first promotional tours ever. And Midland, Texas, you talk about, I mean, it's literally where Bush Jr. came from, right? It is Bush country. And I'm at their library, and there's 200 seats in the room, and they apologized to me as I walked in. They said, "We forgot to do any publicity, so there's only a handful of people here." And I'm like, "I don't care, that's fine." I'm like, "But let's bring them all down to the center." So I asked them to sit close, so it could be, more intimate. Wrong word. There were these two elderly ladies who sat in the very front row, and so I'm standing at a podium, and they are right there. They are as close to me as my computer is right now. And I said, "Does anybody have any questions?"
Oh boy.
And one of them says in a voice so loud, it was clearly meant to reach me. There's no way it couldn't have. She's in the front row, but she's singing it to her friend there, sitting next to her. And she says, "Could you ask him if he ever gets excited by any of those sex scenes he reads? And if so, does he ever record them in the altogether?"
Oh, jeez.
And it's not like I'm a stand-up comedian who knows how to handle hecklers from the audience, but I'm usually pretty fast on my feet, and I had nothing. I just sat there. I just laughed. And I was blushing so hard I thought my face would explode, but I just carried on. I'm like, "Oh, any other questions?"
So, I mean, that's where my mind went. I'm like, are they talking? I go, okay. So, again, thank you for the laughs on that one. It was, but I was like, okay, I know others are going to think the same way that I was thinking. But I was going, yeah, because unfortunately, you guys do get asked that question more often than not. And I was going, oh, God. Don't ask them that, people. But also sometimes some of you, the narrators, have been very open and honest and shared what happens. And so I'm like, okay, if you open that door.
There are a lot of narrator couples.
Yes.
And,
yes.
so.
It's like, hey, honey, need the break for now. Yeah.
Hey, babe, read this.
I just read a great book.
Yeah. And you should too.
Oh, I've said it before with other guests, and I said it to my friends. There have been times where it's, you kind of like highlight and you give it to your partner and you're like, read, learn tonight. And then you're done, kind of a thing. So it happens.
I can imagine like, hey, I kind of left something in the booth for you.
Yeah, but that was like, oh my goodness. And just again, the narration on that was so like spot on, and it was very casual. It was almost like you were like, not even, there's no acting there of sorts. That's, Scott, why you're so good. You're so believable in these characters. You kind of forget that you're listening to the audiobook. You're almost like you're just at a cafe watching someone do, having the conversation out loud. So thank you for that. So guys, I could probably keep you on for hours, but I won't do that for it to you. So before we go, can you guys tell us what you're each individually or together working on next, so we can make it on our list and add it to our calendars?
I am working on a Steve Berry novel.
Steve.
And I believe it's called The Last Kingdom. We're supposed to get started today. Forgive me, I didn't have the title foremost in my mind, to be honest. After 1,000 books, they kind of all blend together a little bit.
No worries.
I can usually remember them after I finish recording them, but yes, I'll be working on Steve Berry's latest Cotton Malone thriller.
Cool. Yeah, Steve's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I met Steve down here in Florida, and he's
Lovely
a
guy.
great guy.
Mhm.
Yeah, great guy. Gave me a blurb for the sale, actually.
Mhm.
Um, for me, I am right now editing. We're in the final stages of the sequel to Huron Breeze, which is Huron Nights. And so that'll be coming out on December 22nd with the Kindle and the paperback. And then soon, Scott and I will be getting together to do our pre-conference for recording. And then that'll be out probably later in the winter, earlier in the spring. And then I'm writing the novella that Suzanne and I will eventually work on. And then it'll be on to the third book and the final one in the trilogy that we'll put out together. So yeah, busy, exciting. It's going to be an awesome 2023.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love asking that question because then I get to add stuff to my calendars and I know what I'm going to be reading and listening to. So thank you.
I tell you what, I one time asked a question like that to my favorite author of all time, Richard Matheson. He wrote Somewhere in Time. He wrote all the great, so many of the great Twilight Zone episodes. He wrote The Incredible Shrinking Man. I mean, and I Am Legend. He wrote so many classic books. And of course, he was pushing 90 at this point. And I asked him, I said, so what's next? And he said, well, I delivered this book a year ago. It's coming out next month. And I just delivered a book a week ago. That'll come out in about a year from now. And there's this long pause. And he said, and then I think I'm done. And I was heartbroken. I mean, it was my favorite author, and he's telling me that he has no more stories to tell. It was just the worst. This was an interview. We were being filmed, and I just wanted to weep. And he passed away. I want to say about 6 months later.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. So note to authors: keep writing. Keep writing.
Well, yeah, the fans are voracious. As soon as the book comes out, they're already emailing or DMing the author. So like, what's next? When is this other one coming out? And they're like, this one just published this morning.
Right.
Yeah, this book nearly killed me to get out.
Yes.
Like when
blood,
Narrator
sweat,
came
and tears.
Yeah, that day we were on a podcast when Narrator came out, and Scott and I was just like, I'm tired.
You're tired. Yeah. I could probably barely be heard at that point. My voice was thrashed.
So yeah, I do get that, Viviana, where it's like, oh, I'm working as fast as I can.
Yeah. I will say though that I would be the first one to advocate for you guys and say I would much rather you guys take your time, delay as needed because life happens, and I get a really, really good book versus you rushing it and half-assing it, and I get a meh kind of a book. And so that's always my 2 cents of sorts. But I think also too, reviews also say similar things. So you know, it's okay to wait. We'll find someone else. We'll find another book. We'll re-listen to something, and fall all in love all over again. But I want to thank you both. Thank you again so much, Landon and Scott, for being here and taking the time to talk to me about this fabulous book called Narrator and other things among that. And then you'll have to tell me offline who Michael was inspired about. But I will include all of your social media links on the landing page over at Viviana, Enchantress of Books for this episode. And until next time, guys, and everyone, happy listenings. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviana.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our Audiobook Lovin Podcast Patreon. Special thanks to Nixley Zenner, Carol Liebner, Brittany Robinette Leiter, Don Darch, Michelle Bastard, Brandy Schmidt, April Branson. The Audiobook Lovin Podcast has special Patreon access levels. Join today to receive benefits including early access to episodes, shout-outs, special exclusive content, and much more. Support the podcast by becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/audiobookloving. We thank you for your support.
Thank you for joining us on the Audiobook Lovin Podcast, hosted by Viviana, Enchantress of Books. For links and more information discussed in today's episode, previous podcasts, or the Audiobook Lovin Series, please visit our website, vivianaenchantressofbooks.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a positive review wherever you listen to our podcast. Until next time, happy listening.